everybody, it's Sarah, and today I am back with another book review, and that review is going to be of Godkiller by Hannah Kana. This book was the buddy read for my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries back in March, I think. My book club is all about reading adult fantasy books written by women and genderqueer folks. In May we're going to read Children of Gods and Fighting Men, that's what it's called. So if you're interested in joining us, all the links are down below. However, today it is all about this book, so let's talk about it. As all of my reviews, I will start with a little summary, or I will try to start with a little summary, and then I think I'm not gonna do my usual negative, positive thoughts thing. I will just ramble a little bit about this book, because I don't have that many concrete negative things. Most of the negative things I have are more down to just my personal preference in books. So yeah, but let's get started to talk about what this is about. This is obviously an adult high fantasy. It is the first book in a new series, although I do not know how many books there will end up being in that series. And in this book, we follow three different characters. The first character we meet is Kissen, whose family was sacrificed to a god when she was just a little child, I think like 11 or 12 years old. She has since become a Vega, who is someone who kills gods for a living. And at the beginning of this story, she meets a young girl, Inara, who needs her help with something. And so she goes on a journey with Inara, who is the second character that we follow. And then there's also a third character that joins them, Elogast, who is a former guard or captain of the King's Guard. And he also has a troubled past and has to go on this journey for his very own reasons. So that's it for the basic gist of what the story is about. It's a pretty classic fantasy story where you have a couple of people coming together for different reasons who for some reason just all have to journey in the same direction, and who have to learn to trust each other, but maybe don't really trust each other because they're keeping secrets from each other. So now that we have that out of the way, let's get into my thoughts. Before I put this book away, there's one thing that I want to mention, and that is that this book is really fucking short. I think it's under 300 pages, which for an adult high fantasy is basically nothing. And the size or the length of this book is something that has a lot to do with the negative as well as the positive things that I have to say about this book. I was so surprised about the length when I first picked up this book. I got it in my Libby Crate subscription, and I was like, this can't be real. Like, it can't be this short. However, I think seeing how short this book was at the same time kind of disappointed me, because I do think that it would have needed more length to become a book that I really love. But also it helped me kind of adjust my expectations before going into this book. So if you have been on my channel for a while, you will know that I prefer very slow moving and complex stories. It's a reason why I often say that I'm not necessarily drawn to novellas, or novellas sometimes aren't really the thing for me because they just don't have the space in their pages to build a story that I usually want for my adult high fantasy, at least. You know, you can write great stories in novellas, but they're not my preferred format for adult high fantasy stories. And so I was slightly worried when starting this book, because I was like, is this really gonna be long enough to build the type of story with the type of complexity that I really enjoy? And I think it was kind of yes and no in certain regards. I think because I saw how short this book was, I adjusted my expectations before going into it. I thought that what I was gonna get was just a fun ride with not too much depth in terms of plot and complexity and so on. And that's pretty much what I got. This story, I think, is great if you want to get into adult high fantasy, because there's not that much there in terms of world building. You have some stuff, and that stuff is pretty clear, it's pretty straightforward. you have this country that had a war a few years ago, and that war was all about eradicating gods, and now gods are outlawed in the country, and you have people like Kissen who go out and kill gods. And so it's pretty straightforward in that regard. Aside from that, you really focus on the characters, you focus on their motivations, you focus on their relationships, and it's really where the book shines. And it's why I absolutely enjoyed and loved the book. I will get to that a little bit more later again. However, at the same time, for me personally, there still wasn't enough world building to where I really loved the book. And I think the length also came to its detriment at a few points, because there was a few times where we didn't have the space to, you know, organically world build. Because when you have organic world building, and with organic world building I mean that, you know, you just throw in a few sentences here and there, you have characters talking about certain events and so on, you usually need a lot more space because you don't have the time to explain it all at once. I didn't feel like there was a lot of exposition dumpy stuff in this book. However, there were like 1 or 2 instances where it was a little bit too much for my personal preference. I'm not generally against exposition dumping, it kind of depends how it's done, but in the way it was done in this book, there were 1 or 2 instances where I was like, okay, my eyes kind of started glazing over, and I was like, let's move on and back to the story again. Also, as I said, there was this war in the past in this country, and I would actually have loved it if we had the space within this book to explore what this war was about, because we do have 2 characters who were part of this war and who were fundamentally changed by it, one more so than the other. And I feel like, you know, it was just there, but there wasn't that much being done with it, and we just didn't have the space to 100% clear up what the deal was with this war now, what happened when, to make the timeline clear and so on. And I think that was just something that, you know, could have been done better if the book had been even just 100 pages longer. Aside from that, to be honest, for me with this book, it was really minor details, because, and that is once again why expectations when going into a book are so important. I think if I had seen a way longer book, and if the world building and the background building had been the same as with this book, and the more pages had just been given to the characters, then I would have probably been disappointed, because, you know, I would have expected a complexer story. But seeing that this book is quite short, I automatically adjusted my expectations, and I was like, yeah, this is just gonna be a fun ride. And wanting that and needing that, I was like, yeah, it was completely fine for me. Aside from that, the one thing that I would say is actively in criticism is that I think a few of the characters, at least Kissen, maybe even Elagast, should have been older. I don't know exactly how old Elagast is, but I think, like, I don't think we actually know exactly how old Kissen is, but she is probably around her mid-20s. And I think that just somehow didn't fit together with how much had already happened in her backstory and with the war and so on. So I personally would have preferred it if Kissen had been at least 30. I think it would have fit her character way better. I think it would have been more interesting, and I don't know, there was just a case once again here in this book where you have mid-20s character in fantasy just to have a mid-20s character, but there's no reason for a character to be in their mid-20s. Aside from that's what's most popular or something. So I would have preferred it if Kissen had been older, and in my mind she is. In my mind, both Elagast and Kissen are at least mid-30s, because, yeah, it's what I feel more comfortable with. I don't know, for some reason, Kissen being in her mid-20s just does not make sense to me at all. Although maybe I did the math wrong, and maybe she's actually older, but, you know, it's that. Now, as for the positive stuff, I already mentioned that the strong point of this story really were the characters. I enjoyed the characters so much. Like, I loved it. I loved the characters. I loved the relationship. I loved the way the found family worked. I loved that, I wouldn't say it's a subversion on the trope because I had a full TikTok video that's like, you know, there's not really a subversion of the trope of a grumpy man gets cheerful little child and adopts it, because the subversion, you know, the thing that's subverted within that original trope is masculinity and femininity, and there's not really anything to be subverted when you have a grumpy woman that adopts a young happy-go-lucky child. Because the goal of the trope is that you have a grumpy person that then becomes more nurturing and opens up, and you know, that's not really a subversion of masculinity and femininity or concepts of masculinity and femininity when a woman does that. Nevertheless, regardless, I loved Kissen and Inara. I loved the two of them together so much because Kissen is very closed off and we just get to see her a couple of times with other people that she really cares about, and she becomes this really caring person and this really warm person in a way where you still feel like she's afraid of fully opening up. And you can see that happening with Inara quite early, but she doesn't show it. Like, you see it from Kissen's POVs that she starts really caring about Inara and is like, this is my child now, I'm gonna take care of this child. But whenever you have Inara's and Elogast's POVs, you don't really see that much because she doesn't show it towards the outside. And I just thought there was a really lovely, amazing dynamic. Also, the book is queer. I think pretty much all of the characters are queer. I'm not quite sure right now if Elogast was bi, however Kissen definitely is bi. You have multiple like surrounding characters that are obviously queer, and I just really enjoyed that. Inara is too young, pretty much, that her sexuality really is of any matter. Also, she has her own stuff to deal with. Then I enjoyed Inara, however, I didn't love Inara. I think Inara was a little bit annoying to me a few times, but, you know, intentionally annoying, so I won't talk about her too much. And then Elogast, the third main character, I really love him as well. He's just so soft. He's just also very soft and caring, and I absolutely adore and love him. He is a big fat cinnamon roll, and yeah, I love the dynamic between the three. I love how it develops, how the relationship develops, and how they very much don't trust each other at the beginning, and then as the book goes on, they start trusting each other more and more. However, they're still keeping secrets, and it's like this back and forth, and it's just a very familiar dynamic that I enjoy again and again. And then something else that I also wanted to mention in this book is the disability inclusivity. Kissen has a prosthetic leg, and it's something that comes up again and again, but not necessarily in a negative way. I want to talk about this a little bit. Obviously, I am myself not disabled, so I am not talking as an own voices reviewer. This is just something that I noticed kind of from the outside looking in. But I read this book a short-ish time after I finished the 11th Metal. The 11th Metal also has a character that uses prosthetics after a certain point in the book, and the way it's done in the 11th Metal, and at first I thought that, like, I had my issues with disability rep in the 11th Metal. I talked about it quite a bit in my review. Like, I had a lot of issues with it actually, but in terms of how the prosthetics were described, I was like, well, it at least seems like the author did some research. However, with the way the prosthetics and putting on the prosthetics, for example, is described in the 11th, I'm saying the 11th Metal the whole time, the 11th cycle. 11th Metal is Brandon Sanderson. The 11th cycle, with the way putting the prosthetics on and stuff is described in the 11th cycle versus Godkiller, is night and day. There is so much love for detail given to the prosthetics within Godkiller, the few times they are, for example, taken on and off. And there's just so many little things where your attention is pulled towards Kissen having the prosthetic, but not in a like negative way, not in a she can't do certain things because of that, but just, you know, as a reminder that is something that she has and that is something that is a part of her, where like I personally probably wouldn't have missed it if it hadn't been there, because I'm not someone who has any prosthetics, but the way attention was pulled towards this part of Kissen was just done with a lot of love a lot of times. At least for me it felt like that, and it's something that I really appreciated, because yeah, it was one of those things where I felt like, again, I wouldn't have noticed it probably as a non-owned voices reviewer if it hadn't been there, but the fact that it was there was something that just really showed that the author put a lot of intention on that. I'm not sure if Hannah Kana herself has any prosthetics, but it was at least something where a lot of research was put into it. And yeah, aside from that, the plot was pretty much a standard plot. I did somewhat see the twists and turns coming, however, that's not necessarily something negative for me, because I have read a lot of fantasy, and a lot of times it just feels good to read something familiar, to read something that falls into familiar tropes, and that was definitely the case for me with this one. And so yeah, overall I would say I enjoyed this book. I can continue recommending it. I gave it 4 stars in the end, I think like between 3.75 and 4 stars, so I really enjoyed it. I really want to see where the second book goes. And again, I think it's the perfect book if you want to get started into adult high fantasy, because it's short, it's sweet, it's not too intimidating, both story and size-wise, and so yeah, I can definitely recommend it. And with that, that was it for my review. Tell me in the comments down below if you have read this book, what were your thoughts on it? If you haven't read this book, did I make you want to pick it up? If you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing, and all the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so go and check those out, and I hope I'll see you very soon. Bye!